was pumping the nation's banks full of reserves. Much of the newly created money found its way into a land boom in Florida and onto the stock market, where prices hardly stayed the same. They soared to dizzy heights. So you had price inflation, but not in everything. Well, the important thing is, how long did that last? When did it come to an end? In the so-called Roaring '20s, we actually have that name that we use to describe a time where we saw many of the classic symptoms of an artificial boom fostered by easy money. Roaring '20s. During that time, with money supply growing rapidly, things looked pretty good. People felt like, wow, except in a few industries, America is doing extraordinarily well. But the problem was that much of this boom was not sustainable. The analogy's often been made to the guy who goes to a party, drinks it up, has a great time, 2 a.m. he stumbles home, and the next morning, of course, he awakens with a horrible headache and a terrible hangover. You wouldn't say that the damage was done the next day at the hangover. No, that's when the damage is felt. The damage was done the night before amid all the fun and the hoopla. That's when the damage is done, and yet it feels pretty good for the moment. You feel the effects of it later. When you look at monetary policy in the 20s to the 30s, you find not anything that looks like stability. You find a very erratic monetary policy. Even non-Austrians like the late Milton Friedman has acknowledged, yes, there was an expansion, then there was a dramatic contraction of the money supply. Dr. Rothbard, I cite him because he did some great work on the Great Depression. He points out that the contraction of the money supply from 29 through 33 amounted to some 33%. Now think of that. First you have, over about a 5-year period, an increase in money and credit by almost 2/3. And then you have a 3 or 4 year period where money and credit collapses by 1/3. Now, I don't think the Fed, nobody argues that the Fed really intended for this. They scientifically calculated it and said, let's contract the money supply by 1/3. It got out of hand. It got even beyond their control as banks collapsed and Congress did some things we'll talk about that made the situation worse. But clearly they were presiding over an erratic policy of monetary expansion followed by contraction. Some people look at the event of October 24th, 1929 and say, well, that's what caused the Depression. October 24th, 1929 was Black Thursday, when the stock market lost one of, if not the worst day up to that moment in our history on the stock market. That was one of many bad days that fall. There would be many bad days just after that. That was on a Thursday. Friday of that week, October 25, the stock market sort of stabilized. President Hoover made a statement about how the business of the country is fundamentally sound. But over the weekend, the negative sentiments that had driven the market down on Thursday reasserted themselves, and there was a stampede. And you had a Black Monday and a black every day of the week before it's all over. Well, this cries out for explanation. Was it the stock market that caused the Depression? I think it was rather a symptom of something much more fundamental going on. The stock market collapsed because it saw the handwriting on the wall, because investors, by the fall of 29, sensed that, hey, the party's over. The smart money saw it early in 29, like the Bernard Baruchs, the Joseph P. Kennedys. They knew that much of the boom had been fostered by easy money and dirt cheap interest rates, and the banks being flush with funds coming from the Fed. They also were the first to see the change in policy at the Fed by late 28, early 29, with the Fed raising interest rates, putting the vice on the money supply. They saw things reversing. The average American didn't see it, not at first. The smart money bails out early. That's why the stock market actually peaked out in the summer, late summer of 1929, August. It had a lot of bad days before the big crash on October 24th. The smart money, the pressure of their selling causes the market to sort of peak out and begin to turn down. It wasn't until the masses of people stampeded in late October that you had the stock crash. But don't mistake that event as being a cause of the Depression. It was a symptom. It was mirroring what was happening to the money and credit supply. If nothing else had happened, perhaps even in spite of this erratic monetary policy, perhaps 1930 would have been a year of stability or even recovery. And this might have gone down in history as one of many sharp downturns, like the prior one in 1921, which lasted only 8 months. Very sharp downturn in the American economy, but we don't remember it much to this day because it lasted 8 months and it was over. It was the last time, in fact, the federal government did essentially the right thing facing an economic depression. It was a depression in 21 that was brought on by the easy money, the low interest rate, inflationary policy to pay for the bills of World War I, and facing the hangover, you might say, of that inflationary episode. Congress and the president, under two presidents, Harding and Coolidge, actually cut tax rates, they deregulated, they reduced the national debt, withdrew the government from much of its grasp of the capital market, balanced the budget, and we recovered very quickly, 8 months. But this one in 1929, 1930 doesn't do that. It actually takes a turn for the worse. So now, that leads me to the second phase of the Great Depression, the phase we call the disintegration of the world economy. The disintegration of the world economy. This begins in the very late spring, June of 1930. So let me take you back first, before I tell you what the events were that precipitated it, to explain the background, what was happening in the economy and in politics in the spring of 1930. This is after the big collapse in the stock market. Guess what unemployment was in the late spring of 1930? It was about what it is today. Right now it's 8.3. It was about 8.5% in the spring of 1930. That's not a depression yet. That's just a recession. And the stock market, which had those bad days in October and November, had actually regained half of the ground it had lost. So from those standpoints, it wasn't looking all that bad. It was looking like, well, this might be over here pretty soon. Not even a depression yet. But in June of 1930, Congress passes and the president signs into law a very destructive piece of legislation that plunges us into the second phase of this painful episode, from recession into depression. And I'm referring to the Smoot-Hawley tariff of June of 1930. What party was in charge of the House and Senate and White House in 1930? Republicans. They controlled it all. And from the days of their founding in the 1850s, they were the high tariff party, the protectionist party. The Democrats, this is less true today maybe between the two parties, but the Democrats had historically been the low tariff party. Republicans, high tariff. So here we are in June of 1930 with this recessionary unemployment. It's nagging, it's high, and we don't want to go into midterm elections in the fall with something like that. So you got to do something, or be perceived as doing something about it. Republicans thought, aha, the way we can get those people back to work is to close the border, or raise tariffs on foreign goods so high that foreigners won't be able to sell as much here, which will mean what? Americans will say, oh, their stuff's too expensive. We'll buy American-made goods. And that'll cause American factories to hire more people to put those unemployed people back to work. That was the thinking. You want to reduce unemployment? Well, then keep foreign goods out, raise taxes on them. Americans will buy goods made at home, and that'll spur employment. That was the thinking. So they passed Smoot-Hawley and raised tariffs to an all-time high. It almost closed the borders to trade. It certainly ignited a worldwide trade war. What they didn't understand, or were not willing to understand, was the fact that trade is ultimately a two-way street. You cannot close the door to imports without closing the door to exports. If foreigners can't sell here, how can they earn the dollars that they need to buy here? And when the Japanese sell us cars, they don't send a boat over with cars and then bring the boat back empty. They bring it back with soybeans or some other American product. But now, if they can't come here with the cars because our tariffs are too high, the